Get cracking. Well, you're right. That's a lovely message. So, good afternoon, all. Thank you all for attending and welcome to today. Obviously, thank you to the Pipeline Industry Guild for hosting us today. I'm Sam Catling. I'm your chair for today's webinar and head of the water sector at Dalcour Maclaren. I'll shortly introduce you to my colleagues Hugh and Ed, who will be your presenters this afternoon. Just for those of you who have joined since the various messages I've said, if you could please just remain muted with your cameras off throughout, great, as we will be recording this afternoon's session. And with questions, if you could just please put all your questions and comments in the chat function, and I'll put these to Ed and Hugh at the end of the presentation. So that leaves me the great pleasure of introducing our presenters today. Ed Higson, I'm going to start with, is our head of generation at Dalcour Maclaren. Has been with DM for over 9 years now. He has spent his 13-year career working across a huge variety of small and large-scale utility and infrastructure projects covering the water and gas frameworks, as well as being involved in cable routes for countless offshore wind farms. His current role as head of generation, he ensures that DM and clients strategically approach the tasks required to deliver major infrastructure projects. The generation team at DM is currently involved in large onshore and offshore wind, nuclear, solar, hydrogen, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage schemes. Lastly, and definitely not least, Hugh Gilmore is an associate director at Dalcour Maclaren, who specializes in developing and implementing land and property strategies to support development across a range of sectors. He has over 10 years experience in major infrastructure projects and development consent order processes, with a majority being on the client side of EDF, leading on land and property aspects on the Hinkley Point C, Sizewell C nuclear power projects. Hugh's focus is on building and developing strong stakeholder relationships across the projects he works on. So I will now hand over to Hugh and Ed, who will present to you today. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the kind words, Sam. Yeah, so just a very quick overview of what we're going to talk about. Very quickly, we'll just introduce Dalcour Maclaren to any of you who aren't familiar with us. Don't worry, it's only going to be about a minute of a slide. I'll then move on to kind of talking about the principles of stakeholder management. I'll then hand over to Hugh to talk about stakeholder management, kind of pre-consenting, and then I'll kind of wrap up talking about stakeholder management in construction and the value of agricultural liaison officers. So in terms of kind of Dalcour Maclaren and what we do, we service a wide variety of clients across the UK, including everything kind of from dealing with access for pressure reducing valves and sewer monitors, all the way through to kind of end-to-end services on nationally significant infrastructure projects and major DCO projects. We offer kind of, as I say, end-to-end services, and that includes utility and infrastructure surveyors, environment and planning services, geomatics, and project management as well. There's some more detail on this slide, but I kind of won't dwell on those. And in terms of kind of our coverage, we've got 13 offices across the UK, with plans for further later this year, and more on into the future. All our teams, which extends to over 360 people, are kind of dedicated to acting solely for the utility and infrastructure sector as well. So in terms of kind of the principles of stakeholder engagement, today I want to kind of talk about kind of reducing risk through stakeholder management, and I'm kind of going to go and start with talking about the principles of stakeholder engagement. And I think that the key to any kind of level of engagement is communication. And this is key to kind of everything we do as a business, not just kind of when we're engaging externally with stakeholders. So that's our engagement with consultants, clients, etc., that are supporting the kind of delivery of client objectives ultimately. But particularly when we're engaging with third parties, on behalf of clients and contractors, it is really important, because it's often kind of the first point of contact that a landowner or occupier may have on a project. And our teams often kind of end up being the face of a project for a number of years. You talk about some nationally significant infrastructure projects, and you're talking about a kind of lifespan of 10 plus years. And you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. So it's really key that you have great communication from the onset, to kind of manage that relationship piece. I think Hugh's going to probably come on and talk a bit more about kind of common strategy in that kind of early stage of engaging on a project. So I won't talk too much about that. Timely and often engagement. I think there's a real balance to this. We want to go to people and ensure that, this is the third point on there, ensure that discussions are informed. There's a balance in when you go and talk to people, but once you've started talking to people and you found the right point to engage, it really is very important that you keep that engagement up, and you keep the comms lines open, and you're communicating regularly. During construction, that's possibly daily or weekly. On kind of projects consenting, it may be less frequent, but it still does need to be regular. And I think all of this is kind of helping to support the kind of management of the risk. All of our engagement is really, really important. And actually, understanding what success looks like in terms of managing risk, we'll kind of come on to later. But it's really about kind of the knowledge of the issues that the landowners, occupiers, and stakeholders have, and being able to kind of give the support, give the advice, and also being proactive enough to be prepared for kind of plan B, plan C, and kind of ensure continued delivery. And then I think the last point there, remember, they're only human. They're there doing their job, be that farming or whatever it might be, and we're there doing the same. So I'll hand over to you at this point.
Thanks, Ed. Hi everyone. I think for me, if we can move on to the next slide, brilliant. The start of this whole process is the key to reducing risk is really having a clear understanding of who and what you're engaging with. It's really clear that no two stakeholders are the same. And a key tool to reducing risk is really beginning with stakeholder mapping. So who and what are we engaging with, and what are their key drivers? So through this, you look to identify all the parties that are impacted by the scheme or may have an influence on the project. So this will include your landowners, your statutory bodies, your members of the public, local interest groups, the Lord of the Manor, whoever else it might be that may or may not be impacted by your project, or may feel that they're impacted by your project. So ensuring you capture as many stakeholders as possible is really key as part of that at this very early stage, because it can have a huge impact, as Ed alluded to, on the entirety of the project. These are people that are likely to be engaging with the project throughout its lifetime. And then it's key that you start to build the bridges in the very early stages. And the best way to do that is actually identify who they are and what goals you need to achieve to get there. So this exercise can be done on multiple levels. So you can go from identifying either the organisation or the company or the landowner, but then right the way down to within those organisations, who holds the pen, who actually is the decision maker, and beginning to understand what are their drivers and where do they take things. So if we can flick to the next slide, Ed. Thanks. So once we've got the who and the what we're going to be influencing, we then need to look at actually what influence do they have on the project? What's their interest in the project? And I won't talk through the table in detail because I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but it's what influence do they have, and it's essential in therefore going forwards and actually developing a bit of a communications plan. So how for each of those stakeholders are we going to take that conversation forwards? What does it look like when we talk to them? What's the manner, the frequency of engagement, and also importantly the level of detail that we're going to be communicating to those individuals or companies as we go through the process. As I said, the table sort of speaks for itself, and I'm sure a number of you have been involved in these before and looked at these tables. But one area of risk reduction that I know we've come across extensively is making sure you repeat this exercise on a regular basis. So make sure you go back and look at who your stakeholders are and what they're doing, but also importantly, what their influence is and what their interests are in the scheme that you're working on. It's certainly, as Ed alludes to, on some schemes, due to the longevity of it, it's not beyond the wit of man that their influence and their interest may change as the project progresses. The project will go through a life cycle, will have various different parts to it, and as will probably the parties that you're engaged with. And so making sure it's very easy to fall in the trap of assuming that they're the bottom left, and therefore someone you're just sort of touching base with, that they migrate to top right without you really noticing. And that can really cause you some significant problems in the long term. So making sure you're alive to that, and you're not ignoring the possibility for parties to move within this, I think is fairly key. So if we can move to the next slide, Ed. Thanks. So now we've sort of had a look at the fact that we've identified who and what, and there's a wide variety of those. What I want to begin to focus in on is those parties which have an interest in land. So landowners, occupiers, tenants, people with rights over land, whatever else there might be. There's going to be a huge variety of those across the varying different projects that we all get engaged in, particularly on the linear schemes. We seem to draw just about everyone and anyone into those, and weird and wonderful rights that date back to sort of medieval times seem to get drawn up on a regular basis. So really it's what are we going to focus in on is like I said, those landowners, and what I just want to spend the next couple of slides talking about is the sort of front end of the process. So that pre-consenting in whatever regime it may be, and the engagement that we have in those, and we'll focus a bit on that, and then Ed will come on to, as he said, the construction part of the process. So if we can flick on again, Ed. Stakeholder management pre-consenting. I love this top left picture. What a beautiful image of direct action when stakeholder management has kind of gone a bit wrong. This is an example of a car parked in the wrong gateway. The farmer took a slight bit of offence, I think we'll say, and decided to politely move the car out of the way. This is the kind of thing that we're looking to avoid at all costs, and it just goes to illustrate when you get it wrong, it can go very wrong. Communication is really key, as Ed said at the start, and you'll see the lovely picture on the top right of Michael Gove and a very enthralled and diverse group of individuals sat around the kitchen table. But what I was looking to really demonstrate is that there is no substitute for that face-to-face contact, and actually getting out there on the ground and talking to people, understanding what the impacts are on them, how they're being affected, and remembering that ultimately in a majority of these schemes, these people didn't invite us in. They didn't ask for the particular scheme to be put there. This has been pushed upon them, and whether you've got statutory powers or you're going through a consenting regime or whatever else, ultimately a landowner or an occupier that's on board is a hell of a lot easier to deal with than somebody that is questioning, querying, stopping you at every turn. So building those relationships and beginning to understand the drivers of your stakeholders, I think, is really key in a pre-consenting environment. Listening to them, I think it's a really underrated skill. Everyone says they listen, but I think a lot of people hear, but they don't listen. We're looking for the gap in the conversation rather than actually hearing and understanding what their concerns are. And at this front end part of the process, that's pretty fundamental. Get it down, understand what's their motivating factors, what's driving them. Are there some easy wins to make some of their concerns go away? So really remembering that they are an important part of that process. And the pre-construction engagement is really about explaining what's happening, how we're going to do it, when we're going to do it, and ultimately looking to get some kind of agreement on the table, that whether that be around survey access as demonstrated in the other pictures, or just teeing up whatever particular agreement you need to undertake the works that are planned. There's a variety of conversations that can take place, and in a majority of instances people are actually interested. This might be the only time they've been affected by a scheme of some description, and actually they've got a genuine interest. Even if they don't like the concept, they've got an interest in what you're doing and how you're going to go about doing it, and what they may take away from it. If there's any benefits to them beyond the financial, I think is always an interesting one. Those bits in the margins always can make a difference. So if we can flick to the next one, please, Ed. Now we've identified who we're talking to, we've listened, so we know what potentially their issues are and what the risks to our projects may be. We then need to talk about how we're going to mitigate those. And on the slide are hopefully stuff that isn't rocket science to anybody, but it's important that it's done and it's not just a box ticking exercise. So I think for me and our experience on the variety of projects we've worked on, honesty is a huge part of that. It's fundamental to the way that we operate, the way that we work, and that goes across from the client to the consultants to the guys on the ground to everybody else involved. And as part of that honesty, it's what will the level of impact be? When are we thinking of doing it? If timescales are slipping, etc., etc. But also not being afraid to admit when we've got it wrong. No matter how well planned a project is, I'm not sure I've worked on one yet where something hasn't gone wrong, from the very small and minor to the pretty major. But being honest and open enough to say that something's gone wrong and bringing the landowners, the occupiers, etc., on that journey of understanding, I think is pretty fundamental. Trying to brush stuff under the carpet doesn't do anyone any favors and ultimately comes back to bite you. So I think that's a pretty big one for me. And as part of that, as Ed alluded to, I think clear communication, and that is equally as important within an organization as it is externally. So there's no point in having your lovely communications plan and talking to your key parties every week, every day, if you've got nothing to tell them. If the communication is not coming from the client, coming from the consultants, coming from the construction teams, making sure everybody's on the same page of understanding. So those messages are getting through. We're giving as much time lead in as we can for notice periods, for things that are happening, etc., etc., and just keeping those communications channels open, I think is probably one of the biggest risk mitigation factors. And Ed will talk about some of how we implement that on the ground once we've got to construction, but actually having that visibility and just people understanding where things are. Things change, everybody gets that, but if they didn't hear about it till you turned up on site and the last time you spoke to them was 6 months ago, I can understand why you might be a little bit annoyed. It's sometimes just putting yourself in their shoes. If this was your field, your garden, how would you feel? What would you expect to hear from your construction team, from the consultants or whoever else? And then I think we've all done the hard yards, we've got an agreement in place, we're ready to come to site, and then nobody bloody pays me. There's nothing more frustrating from a negotiation perspective when you think you've closed it out and then there's a delay or an error in the payment. So it seems really simple, but actually getting a good process going for payment, making sure you've got the right sign-offs, you've got client accounts, you've got bank account details, etc., that timely payment happens is really key to building that level of trust and that understanding from the landowners. They will soon start to switch off if you're not paying. And we go back to the picture before of the forklift lifting the car out of the way. That's not too dissimilar, I think, to the way some people feel when you're desperately asking them for access, but you've not quite got around to paying them yet. So again, another one just to tick off the list. I've touched on listening and I won't sort of dwell on that one, but I think it is, again, a huge mitigation factor. If you just understand what's driving that particular landowner, that occupier, that interested party, what is it they want to get out of this, or how best do we mitigate it? Is it because they've got a chicken farm nearby and your noise of your construction is going to cause them an impact? Is it the vibration that's a problem? Is it just the sheer alarm, something that can be done at the earlier design level that they can be mitigated through? So just listening and understanding. And consistency, I know it's extraordinarily difficult on any project I've worked on to be consistent across all your messaging and all the time, particularly in that pre-construction phase where you're in consenting. There's numerous surveys going on, there's numerous conversations around who's doing what, the route might change, the impacts may change, etc., but being consistent in explaining that, being open and honest, again back to the original point that things may change. And the consistency as well doesn't just go for the message, but also goes for the individual. So if you can, trying to keep the same people having those conversations and making sure that they understand who's there, the person they can reach out to. So consistency in approach and consistency in personnel can go a very long way to making that work. And linked to the personnel piece, I think, is local knowledge. Too many projects I've worked on, the first thing you get is, you're not from around here, you've come down from London, you've come down from X, Y, and Z, but actually building up that local knowledge, having someone that's lived and breathed it, understands the local environment, the local politics, some of the other local issues that may be there, and someone that ultimately the parties can relate to, I think can go a very long way. And ultimately, if it all goes wrong or starts to creak and groan a little bit more, you've got records to fall back on. How many conversations have you had? What was said at those conversations? Did you really promise that you were going to do that? And I think that can help, not just from the consenting side when you get challenges, but also if personnel change on a job, to help with that consistency, that you can delve back in and say, actually, no, at that meeting in January, we didn't agree that. Our records state that this is what happened. So for me, that's really, I'm hoping a lot of that's not new, but it's just reinforcing it. And again, it's down to doing the basics well, and just making sure that not only are we talking to people who are affected, but we're talking to our own organisation and making sure everybody's on the same page. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully helpful. So I'll now pass over to Ed to lead on. Once you've got that magic consent and it's in the bag and you get to site, what happens next?
Thanks, Hugh. And I kind of picking up on your kind of final point, or one of your final points there, really kind of consistency, and actually, it's almost a seamless passage from consenting to then kind of construction. Obviously, there's kind of different kind of knowledge and skill set that are required for construction, and that kind of very much sits with the agricultural liaison officer. I'm kind of not going to read the kind of script there that I kind of wrote, which is probably their essence or kind of their kind of high level job description. But yeah, if you read that, in terms of kind of what I'm going to say about them, I think we've had feedback on ALOs over the years, and I think that feedback is demonstrating a site presence from an agricultural and land perspective, on active construction sites that yields results and can support and facilitate construction projects. They really engage with the landowners and occupiers proactively, ensuring that delays are reduced, and always having a backup plan, able to add value and explain construction activities in a way that kind of landowners, occupiers understand, and have an in-depth understanding of important topics that are affecting kind of landowners, occupiers and farmers as well. So in terms of the benefits of ALOs and kind of a little bit about what they typically do in a day, they're kind of we talked about communication right at the very start, but they're taking the pressure off the project team, the project managers, the construction managers. Their dedicated role is really having the time to kind of deal with and prioritize the landowners and occupiers. They understand what the concerns are, and they're able to filter out what are the real concerns that kind of the landowners and occupiers might have, and supporting the facilitation of daily works and site access, again taking it from the project team, taking ownership, taking responsibility of it, and actually being the representative for the project on the ground, and they're probably the first port of call for the gate left open at 7 in the morning, and the last port of call in the evening when the gate gets left open again, but they're there all the time and there to support the project. They're providing advice all the way through, and have a real understanding of the contractor's requirements. They're not kind of playing Chinese whispers between the landowner and contractor. They understand what the contractor and client are trying to deliver, and they can, as I say, kind of pass that message on in a fairly clear and landowner friendly way. They're always about on site, and understand soils, crops, reinstatement, drainage, all these kind of big ticket items, and actually able to kind of support and advise clients and contractors on actually reducing liabilities and actually avoiding any kind of possible conflicts before they actually happen. I've kind of touched on technical insights already, and I think just generally having respect and empathy, and being able to kind of talk on a par with the landowners and stakeholders. So I think in understanding the important things, and by important things I mean important things for your landowners, farmers, customers, however you refer to them under your kind of powers. These guys, as landowners and farmers, aren't necessarily interested in the contractors program. The main concerns for them, and I guess probably in no particular order, they may be in an order, but first of all, it's money, and from a kind of scheme perspective, that means for them and possibly their agent trying to maximise compensation, and having an ALO actually you can that can support in managing that. Secondly, they want to continue to farm and run their business. This is their business. It may have been in the family for generations. It might be a fairly new enterprise, but for them, the important things on that is really ensuring that there's appropriate accommodation works, so they can pick up the phone to someone if there's a kind of issue, or they can't get a combine through a gate, things like that, and issues can be dealt with to allow them to kind of continue to do what they do on a day-to-day basis. Slightly contentious, but doing no worse than their neighbour, and Hugh alluded to this, but it's very much making sure that actually we've got a consistent kind of land right strategy, common strategy, and really ensuring that we kind of stick to that. We know landowners talk to their neighbours, and unless they've had a boundary dispute, they're generally kind of fairly regularly talking. So we just need to make sure that there's always consistency there. And as a colleague always says to me, we want to be fair but not over generous. And again, it's consistency with that. I think more specifically, landowners' main concerns are things like drainage, and reducing soil damage. They're trying to do that on a daily basis through reducing their kind of agricultural impact on their land as well. So they're naturally kind of cautious when projects like this come along, but drainage and soil both intrinsically link back to money and continuing to farm and run their business. So yeah, I think having empathy for these points above. Landowners are typically interested in, or typically very interested in their own businesses, and the ALO will show a genuine interest in that, and actually as I said earlier, tease out what the real concerns are, but actually also kind of glean information that can kind of support compensation claims, give you a better understanding of kind of what's going on site, crop rotations, when access is going to be required for their agricultural operations, etc. So what risk can an ALO reduce? I've broken it down into kind of three key areas really. Time, we all know from the last 15 months, but there's nothing more frustrating than wanting to go out and you've got nowhere to go. So as a contractor, when you've got nowhere to go and you're sat on your hands, there's delay times, etc., it can be pretty frustrating, no doubt. So the ALO, with the support of a kind of good construction team and a good program, we'll be able to support this and actually reduce the amount of kind of downtime, and kind of hopefully manage and able to facilitate kind of changing expectations on program. Time is money. ALOs don't just drink coffee and talk to farmers, all the time while they're talking, and kind of doing the softer touch kind of stakeholder management. They're also kind of collating information, liaising and discussing and kind of logging concerns, logging problems that may be coming down the line. And kind of by doing this, they're really recording and logging all landowner comms, which will help to really support and manage settlement of things like compensation claims, and reducing kind of liabilities. And in these kind of bits of comms that they have with stakeholders, they're constantly talking about drainage, soils, reinstatement, things that are kind of hot topics to the landowners, and actually they're able to kind of report that back to the clients and contractors, which again supports kind of the management of budgets, and again ultimately kind of informing decisions and close out of liabilities. And the last one on the list really is reputation. I think now we're kind of moving into and living in a world with really a kind of triple bottom line, and our reputation is far more kind of susceptible to tarnish due to people having Google and stakeholders having Google at their fingertips and being able to kind of research and suddenly become very knowledgeable about land law or whatever the topic might be. We've got social media and the media, which will very quickly latch on to problems, and we're kind of very much living in a more blaming and slightly aggressive culture. So reputation is very much up there, and the ALO is constantly kind of thinking about that. And we need to all be more aware of it. And a simple way an ALO does this on a daily basis is very much kind of just talking and communicating with the affected parties, and actually, just kind of nipping things in the bud before they become too much of an issue, really. Influencing things when things possibly don't go as right as they could do. From a reputational perspective, clients and contractors are always looking to do the right thing, but sometimes things happen that are outside of their control, be it weather conditions or whatever else it might be. I think the key to this is very much being upfront about it. If you've driven into the gate and bent the gate, go and have the conversation, apologise. People understand, and put yourself on the front foot. It's about having kind of open lines of communication, and not shutting down and getting too defensive. Be on the front foot. And I think you alluded to it earlier, but it's this long-term relationship piece of building up credit ultimately with these stakeholders. 98% of the time things go right, so we need to kind of focus on those positives. So actually when the 2% happen, be that inside or outside of our control, actually we can hopefully come to a swift and satisfactory conclusion for everyone, and things don't get too adversarial, really. I'll just run through a couple of examples of kind of things that have happened and some kind of positive impacts that ALOs have. First one there is the middle image. That is someone actually receiving a general vesting declaration, which is effectively compulsory purchase notice, and cover letter there. And believe it or not, they are actually smiling under that kind of emoji. I've put that there for obvious reasons. But yeah, the reason they're smiling, and the reason why they're getting the notice in the barn is because of the relationship that the ALO had. Unfortunately, we couldn't conclude a voluntary agreement with them for reasons outside of ours and really their control as well. But this has been messaged and been consulted on for a number of years. And there was a real emphasis over kind of a 6-month lead into the receipt of that notice with kind of open communication, be that through the wider support team, but also the ALO on site. So there was no surprise when that notice turned up that morning a while ago. But yeah, so kind of some key stakeholder management there. I think the other two images kind of speak for themselves a little bit, but another example is an instance in February this year during prolonged wet weather conditions and well ahead of kind of a client's program. There's a requirement for 6 kilometres of temporary haul road stone to be removed. Conditions just weren't appropriate at all, but we did manage to secure access for 48 hours later, and that was very much based on the landowner giving us the say so to do that, having looked at having the ALO having looked at the forecast, and in their opinion it being appropriate 2 days later. That morning the landowner didn't turn up because they trusted the ALO's kind of opinion. The ALO had gone to site that day and suggested it was absolutely fine, and the program kind of carried on a couple of days later. In the meantime, this is a kind of talking about a 40-kilometre cable route. There's obviously different weather pockets and different ground conditions and soil conditions. In the meantime, though, there wasn't a 2-day delay. They were able to facilitate access elsewhere along the route as well. And then the last very short example, but a little bit, going the extra mile. The ALO, having a very good relationship with the landowner, was approached because the landowner had some frustrations because his printer had broken. The ALO kindly offered to help him organise for the paperwork to be printed in the office, a couple of miles down the road, and took it back the following day when he needs to go and see him anyway. So, it's just those little bits of kind of going the extra mile to build up that relationship, resulted in the landowner getting his application in on time, and he was over the moon, and we came, that there was benefits to the project in terms of a reputational piece as well. I think this is the last slide of the presentation, but I think in terms of kind of lessons learned, I think we've learned probably quite a lot over the last 15 months in terms of communication. And I think probably one of the big lessons learned for me is you can't replace a face-to-face meeting, but you can come close and still deliver results through Teams and Zoom, workshops, things like that. We've seen clients do some pretty amazing things with virtual kind of Section 42 consultation events and things like that. So it's really about embracing technology. The image there is very much a landowner embracing technology, I guess, and in terms of some pretty fancy, expensive kit there. We need to continue to do that, and as projects come along, they're only getting larger and larger. So we need to continue to move with that, so that we can kind of deal with large scale projects with high stakeholder numbers, and do it efficiently, but do it without losing the essence and that personal touch as well. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Cheers, Ed and Hugh. That was really, really good, really, really informative. I think my chat function must be broken because there doesn't seem to be a lot of questions coming through. Hopefully everyone stored them up for the end. But we do have a really good one from Matt Ducker first, which I will ask, and I'll let Ed and Hugh you choose who leads on it. So is it ever a good idea to design around a difficult landowner, and what risks can this lead to?
I think there's almost a politician's answer in that one. It depends. I think in all reality, it really does on what the scheme is, and what the costs and program impact might be to doing that. I think in some instances where you're looking at they're on the periphery of a scheme, then yes, I think it can be beneficial to try and design them out. But ultimately, there's always going to be another cost associated, and you've got to make sure you go fully informed, I think, before you look at any design change. So what you don't want to do is design out one particular landowner and just jump into an even worse scenario with a different landowner. So I think it's going in with your eyes open, and making sure that you've got clear visibility of what else is around you. But I think, yes, there are times where it does work to design out a particular landowner, depending on their particular concerns around a scheme. But the big risks you run, and I think Ed, feel free to jump in, is that you do begin to set a precedent potentially of that treatment and of sort of fairness of, well, how the hell did they get out of this, and why am I still impacted? And groups of landowners getting together and forming interest groups and coming en masse to say you need to avoid our land. So I think that's probably one of the bigger risks that you run in looking at designing someone out. But Ed, I don't know if you've got any more than that.
No, I was just going to add in terms of sometimes actually it's actually the landowner themselves that kind of want tweaks within their holding, and that's an interesting one, in as much as going around the field boundaries, adds bends, adds length possibly, obviously we need to take on board the concerns they've raised, whether they're valid, or how valid they are. But it is quite interesting when landowners aren't kind of unaccepting of the project or the proposal, but they want changes to kind of to improve their situation. So typically it's a case of actually having a conversation and bringing in the kind of the client and the wider consultancy team, be that technical consents, etc., and actually doing a risk assessment effectively of the two proposals, and that can include stakeholder responses.
Cheers, both. Okay, no more questions coming through. I do have a couple to ask you. Hugh, this is sort of more directed at your part of the presentation. What is the most common reason you see a conflict arise with stakeholders, and what approach do you take to resolve this common problem?
I think it's normally the impact on their business. So it's what does it mean for them? And again, it comes back to some of the stuff I talked about in the presentation about listening and understanding. What is it that's caused this concern or impact on them, and trying to get to the root of that. Are there ways it can be designed out? Do they actually fully understand what we're proposing to do? I think it's a default position for everybody to assume the worst case. And actually sometimes just sitting down and talking through what techniques are you using, how are you actually going to construct this, images of or real examples of where this particular scheme has been done elsewhere. Have you laid that pipe or that cable or whatever, and showing what the site looks like when it's been put back again. And actually, in a majority of instances, the impact isn't anywhere near as bad as people envisage. I mean, there's some fantastic shots of where cables, etc., have been laid through hillsides and then recovered, and sort of five years later or so, you wouldn't even know they'd been there. So I think it's trying to talk them through and let them understand actually what's going to happen if they've not been impacted by a scheme before. Like I said, I think the default is always to assume the worst case, that this area of land will never be farmed again, the drainage will be rubbish, they'll never get it back to where it was. As we know, every field that's impacted by a scheme was the best field I've got, the best land, best yielding. And you have to work with that. That's part of it. But I think just explaining and actually taking them on that journey of what it is you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and get into the detail with them, I think can go a long way.
Manage that change. Yeah, very good. Ed, do you have anything to add? Or Hugh's pretty covered that pretty well, hasn't he?
Well, he has, yeah. And the only thing I would say is, I think in the media and in kind of farming press, there's obviously a lot about HS2, given the scale of it. And I think, it's very different to, pipe, cable schemes, etc. In as much as actually, there's a permanent kind of railway line that's going to be there. There's going to be noise, and permanent disruption. So I think there's a perception that when you possibly turn up, and are looking to acquire rights, there's almost this feeling that it's a kind of permanent impact. It's not. It's a buried cable. Yes, you need rights to go back and repair and maintain, but ultimately, there isn't particularly a change to the surface. There might be the odd manhole cover and a marker post in a boundary, but it isn't that big project like HS2 that obviously there's a lot more in the press about it at the moment, really.
Yeah, good point. Nothing coming through on the chat, so I will, if you don't mind, I'll ask another question. So there's obviously many sort of difficult conversations you potentially have to have. What are those sort of what is the most difficult message you have to give, and what approach do you take to giving it, and what have your teams learned as to the sort of best practice in that sort of situation?
I see Hugh's still on mute, so I'll start with this one, I guess. I think before you kind of go into any situation, I think prior preparation, and actually understanding the full facts, and that's understanding the kind of backstory of how you've got to that point in time, and got to that point of a conflict, and actually what the outcomes want to be or need to be for your client, for the contractor, but also what you think the kind of landowner is trying to achieve out of it as well. And it's kind of putting that jigsaw puzzle together in your own head before kind of firing at the hip on an email or kind of going into a meeting half prepared. So I think it's really about preparing for it. I know your question was what was kind of the most difficult situation. I think every you're talking about people's livelihoods, you're talking about people's property. There's lots of kind of fairly difficult situations that we deal with all the time. But I think kind of that early engagement that you talked about, and actually, you know, having an ALO and someone that can deal with things on a day-to-day basis can help, and it actually can remove the conflict from a situation, because actually you can almost have two channels of communication. So you can have the ALO and the landowner talking, and separately, you know, the representatives are talking about some perhaps much bigger issues, you know, be that compensation or whatever else. So I think it's, you know, and I think probably my last point is probably recognizing where it's actually just a personnel issue. You know, sometimes actually it's just, you know, the landowner doesn't like the ALO or the agent or whoever it might be, and it's just recognizing that and going, right, okay, the landowner can't change because we're not moving the route, but we can change up the or change around the personnel that we utilize to kind of get the best results, and use someone else in the team.
Thanks, Ed. Hugh, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to say the only thing I'd add to that, I think, is it's recognising that this is personal. I think that's what makes some of those conversations the most difficult. This isn't a commercial asset. This isn't something that they just picked up last week. As it's often said, farming is one of the only industries where they're basically holding it for the next generation. So it's being having that level of empathy, and actually not just being the big corporate machine that comes in whatever guise that is, and having that empathy right the way through the process. So I think some of the most difficult conversations are the kind of around the kitchen table while people are in tears, having that kind of, we've been here forever, this is having a huge impact. And as I said, then it's that conversation about, actually, do you really fully understand what we're doing, how we're going to do it, what impact it's really going to have, not just what you think it might have. And really being alive to that whole piece. And as Ed said, I think some of it comes down to the individuals. We had a case in the last couple of weeks. We were out on site doing some site investigation works, and one of the contractors there just, unfortunately, was not a particularly empathy-driven person, and the landowner was trying to understand what they were doing, and while the contractor just stood there and sort of shrugged and was very smug and very dismissive of the landowner entirely, it got to the point where we got kicked off the fields. We were back on within a couple of hours once it had all been worked through, but just ensuring that not only that the agents and others that are engaging, but everyone that engages with the landowner appreciates how difficult some of this can be for them, and has that level of empathy, whether that's the guy digging a hole in the field or the people sitting around the table having either the kitchen table or the board table having those conversations, understands that, as I said, in a majority of instances, this wasn't invited, it is being pushed upon them, and not losing sight of that particular fact.
Okay, good. We do have a couple of questions. I'm going to ask this all as one question, and I would imagine that will probably be the last before we sort of close out. So Fiona Ferguson has asked, what background do ALOs generally have? And then the next question is, have you had stakeholders who do not want face-to-face and are not comfortable with virtual meetings? If so, how have you managed? Also, is there anything you do that helps create a relationship virtually?
I think in terms of kind of the backgrounds to ALOs, these are hugely varied. You know, we've got a really diverse kind of ALO team within the business that are kind of delivering a really diverse number and type of projects. You know, there's only a finite amount of resource within the industry, and ALOs are a real asset to the business. In terms of backgrounds, you know, they might be agricultural college leavers. They might have had previous careers in agriculture, or you know, just kind of lived rurally and understand kind of rural affairs and kind of, you know, farming operations. But I think, you know, given the fact that they're kind of liaising with contractors, clients and farmers on a kind of daily basis, you know, and any experience around those kind of three areas are really, you know, really where we're looking at. And you know, if they've got one or two of the three, you know, we can teach the rest, and you know, support them on a career path with us, really. And face to face, 15 months ago, I don't think we'd have, you know, we've had the door put shut in our face, and I think, you know, and Teams wasn't really a thing that we would necessarily do with landowners, you know, 18, 15 months ago. You know, it's a case of, you know, trying again, writing a letter. You know, we don't, as a rule, do a cold call unless we really are struggling to track people down. But yeah, you know, creating relationships with people virtually is probably a little bit difficult in this forum. You know, we have done, as I mentioned, kind of consultation events virtually, and the benefits of that are, you know, someone doesn't have to be there between 12 and 5 or whenever the consultation event is happening in the village hall. You know, that virtual kind of world is open 24/7 for the 6-week period or whatever the consultation period might be. So that has benefits and gives us a greater outreach for consultation. But I think, you know, and people can feed back through that. But I think, you know, as a follow-up to that, you know, really your face-to-face is far better to get down to the kind of nuts and bolts of issues that people have. You know, correspondence, you know, we need to keep correspondence and log of communications. But I think, you know, to get to the bottom of real issues, it's phone calls, it's Zoom calls, and it's actually getting around the coffee table or the agent's office and talking about them.
Yeah. Hugh, do you have anything to add?
I don't think so. I think it's that if you can't do it face to face, it doesn't necessarily have to be virtual. It could still be a phone call. You can still have some very good conversations over the phone. You know, if you can't get them on Zoom or get them on Teams, then don't be afraid to actually just call them, pick up the phone, have that conversation, start the dialogue. Anything that begins to build that relationship, understanding that they're obviously busy people as well. They've got completely different pressures. They're working odd hours, etc., etc. So just anything that really gets you talking to them and opens those lines of communication has got to be seen as a positive, I think. So not getting too hung up on it being virtual. I'd say there's no substitute for face-to-face in a number of scenarios, but actually finding another way of doing it that works for them. Some landowners prefer a text message or something else once you start to begin to build that relationship. So I think it's just opening the lines of communication is key for me, and again, doing nothing different than you do if you're doing face to face. I think the same kind of things work. It's that doing the basics well, again, as we sort of talked about.
Brilliant. It's great. Thank you both. Well, it's we've run over slightly, so I will bring everything to a close. I just want to thank everyone for attending and for contributing and asking questions and everything today. It's been great. Thank you to the presenters, Ed and Hugh. It was brilliant. Thank you very much. And obviously, finally, to the Pipeline Industry Guild, Kate and Catherine, for hosting us today. It's been brilliant. And that is it. Thank you all, and hope you all have a great day.